Let's take a look at some important dates in the history of the Vietnam War. 1862, 1881. French conquest of Vietnam. France conquers Vietnam and establishes it as a colony while brutally oppressing the Vietnamese people. French rule will last for almost 100 years. World War II, November 1940. Japan invades northern Vietnam, forcing the French to retreat south. Japanese occupation of Vietnam. September 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares independence from both France and Japan and establishes the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. A communist government in exile is set up in Hanoi. The French seek to reassert control over Vietnam after their defeat by the Japanese. World War II. The Geneva Accords temporarily divide Vietnam into northern and southern zones along the 17th parallel. France agrees to withdraw from Vietnam. October 1945. The First Indochina War begins between French colonial forces and Viet Minh guerrillas led by Ho Chi Minh. The battle is considered a turning point in the war, as it leads to the collapse of French efforts to retain control over Vietnam. March 1946. Negotiations between the French and the Viet Minh lead to the temporary suspension of hostilities. The CIA trains and supports various anti-communist groups in South Vietnam in an effort to counter the growing influence of communism. This policy proves unpopular and counterproductive. June 1954. France suffers a decisive defeat. Dien Bien Phu. President John F. Kennedy increases the number of U.S. personnel to nearly 17,000 by the end of his presidency. The U.S. government fears the growing radicalization of South Vietnam's population and seeks to prevent a communist takeover of the country. Vietnam is divided along the 17th parallel, with elections to be held in 1956 to reunify the country. Two U.S. destroyers report being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. By the end of 1964, approximately 200,000 U.S. soldiers have entered Vietnam. This event will be used to justify the increased American involvement in the war. Major battles occur in the Central Highlands and along the coast of South Vietnam. For the first time, U.S. ground troops engage in direct combat with North Vietnamese Army soldiers. While a military defeat for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, the Tet Offensive has a profound impact on American public opinion about the war, in which he comments on the war in Vietnam and predicts his own assassination. Television images of the fighting shake the nation. Riots and protests erupt in more than 100 cities across the United States. 4 students are killed by members of the Ohio National Guard. He establishes a dictatorship and receives support from the United States. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the NVA demonstrates its ability to project military force across South Vietnam. July 1954. The Geneva Accords are signed, officially ending the First Indochina War and recognizing the independence of Vietnam. The Cambodian incursion is kept secret from the public and leads to protests on college campuses across the U.S. Students for a Democratic Society organized nationwide demonstrations against the war. This top-secret study reveals the true history of the U.S. involvement in the war. Since 1945, it describes the many deceptions and lies told to the American people by the U.S. government. On April 30, 1975, President Ford signs a decree ending the military conflict known as the Vietnam War. Vietnam is once again unified under the control of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This remote jungle region becomes a critical part of the war. The U.S. agrees to release 561 prisoners of war in exchange for 80 American prisoners held in North Vietnam. All U.S. troops are withdrawn from Vietnam. 1955. Ngo Dinh Diem becomes Prime Minister of South Vietnam and refuses to participate in the scheduled elections. He wins the election by a narrow margin against Hubert Humphrey. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Thanks for watching. During his campaign, Nixon pledges to end the war in Vietnam. In fact, only 24,000 troops will leave immediately, with the remainder gradually withdrawn over a year. May 1957. The National Liberation Front of Viet Cong is formed in South Vietnam to fight against the Diem regime and U.S. involvement. November 1955, September 1960. U.S. involvement in Vietnam. August 1960. The Strategic Hamlet Program is launched by the South Vietnamese government to force rural populations into protected villages, seen as an attempt to cut off Viet Cong supply lines. Seen as a tactical victory for the Americans but a strategic victory for the Vietnamese, due to the high casualty rates on both sides. October 1962. The first U.S. combat troops arrive in Vietnam, totaling around 800 military advisors. February 1963. Diem is assassinated in a coup backed by the CIA. 1964. Escalation of the war. U.S. military and financial aid to South Vietnam increases significantly. The Gulf of Tonkin incident occurs in August 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is passed by Congress, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to deploy U.S. troops to Southeast Asia. 1965. The war widens, geographically. 1965. The first U.S. combat deaths in Vietnam occurred during Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained aerial bombing campaign against North Vietnam. July 1965. U.S. airmen began intensive bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. June 1966. The first major engagement between U.S. and NVA forces takes place at the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, 1966 to 1968. The war intensifies. Major battles include the 1967 Tet Offensive and the 1968 Easter Offensive. January 1968, Tet Offensive begins, a surprise attack on numerous targets across South Vietnam. January 30th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., a prominent civil rights leader, delivers his final speech. I've been to the mountaintop. April 4th, 1968. Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. May 9th, June 1968. The U.S. Senate begins debating the Vietnam War. The debate is highly contentious and reflects deep divisions within the country over the war. June 1968. The presidential election is held. Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. are assassinated during the campaign season, leaving Senator Richard Nixon as the Republican nominee. 1969. Nixon expands the war into Cambodia. May 1970. At Jackson State College in Mississippi, members of the Mississippi Highway Patrol and the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division fire into a dormitory, killing 2 students. May 1970, the U.S. Supreme Court rules in the landmark case Tinker v. Des Moines that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. May 1970, Nixon announces the withdrawal of all U.S. combat troops from Vietnam. 1971, the Pentagon Papers are published by the New York Times and the Washington Post. 1973, the Paris Peace Accords are signed by the U.S., South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. 1975. Saigon falls to North Vietnamese forces on April 29, 1975. South Vietnam is quickly overwhelmed. This has been a Vietnam War timeline.